In December, I attended the Great British Hobbit League finale, a competitive 2-day event where serious players from all over the country come to try and improve their standing with some last-minute points. I, however, am not a serious player, and if you've seen my last video you'll know where this is going, because I put together an army made entirely out of Christmas characters. So let's find out how Santa and the gang can do against the hobby's heavy hitters. After waking up in a strange little hotel in Stapleford, Graham and I hit the road. We had to make a brief layover to grab our friend Hayden from a nearby station, and his train was running late, of course, but we eventually hooked him up and we were finally on our way.
Hello.
The event was being held in a village hall in Trowell, north of Nottingham, and it was being catered by Seven City Collectibles, which meant that there'd be excellent breakfast maps. Which is basically the only reason I go to these things. Anyway, whilst I have my own Ed Miliband moment trying to eat a bacon sandwich like a horse, let's go through my army for the weekend. It is called Merry's Christmas, which I think is an excellent joke. And just to remind you that all my miniatures in all my armies are assigned to Patreon so we can find out who's unlucky and who's lucky, the owner of the MVP in each tournament wins a prize. We start with Santa Gast, who is Radagast on Sleigh. He is assigned to Bas Jelsma. In his warband is a Christmas Robin, who is played by a Great Eagle. He goes to Archimede. We have the Lady Galadriel wrapped up all nice and warm and drinking a nice cup of hot chocolate. Instead of her mirror, she's accompanied by an utterly terrifying snowman. Galadriel as Mrs. Claus goes to Christopher Cooper and the snowman goes to Doc Munoz. My Christmas elf armed with candy cane riding Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer goes to Will Champion. In game he is of course Thranduil, King of the Woodland Realm. Finally, my beautifully dressed Christmas tree, Beard, goes to Marcel. Finally, I have to thank Chris Powell for coming down and giving up an entire weekend of his time to help me with these conversions. I just think they look fantastic. I was so pleased with how they came out. And if you want to see how we did them, that's all in the previous video. Back to the tournament, the first pairings were being drawn and we were getting ready to begin. Now unfortunately, I'm absolutely gutted to say I've completely lost one of the cameras that I used for filming all weekend. It was the camera that would point at my head, and normally I'd say, well great, that's a late Christmas present to all of you, you don't have to have any close-ups of my face. However, it also took the audio from both lapel microphones. There's therefore none of the banter from any of the 6 games. I'm really sorry to you and to my opponents who might be disappointed after having agreed to be filmed. Anyway, let's dive into game 1. I'd be playing community bigwig and content creator from the Guardians of Wiltshire YouTube channel, Dewey Evans. Unfortunately for me, Dewey had brought a competent list, including a mixture of the Serpent Horde and Far Harad. That's a deadly combination of poison, camel lances, numbers, and some big hitting heroes too. What made things worse was the scenario. Command the battlefield. If you don't know, that means trying to outnumber your opponent's models in each of the 4 table quarters. That's a tall order when you have one more model than you have table quarters. It also uses the random Maelstrom deployment, although I got very lucky on my deployment rolls and everything arrived together on the left-hand side of the board. Now, I was hobbled right from the outset in this game, but in quite an unusual way. People who have played me know that I take my time making my decisions. However, normally once I reach a conclusion, I do stick it out. I go through with a plan, for better or for ill. However, in this game I was hobbled by the most extreme decision paralysis. I just didn't know what to do. It didn't help that this is the first time ever that I've played one of these all-hero armies. Now in hindsight, I know that I should have stuck in a little clump with all my models together, but for some reason, I sent poor Thranduil off on his own. I think I thought the thinking was that I can't have all my heroes together if I'm trying to capture table quarters. In hindsight, I just needed to go around and mop up as many models as I possibly could and see if I can get hero kills and breakpoints. Therefore, I can't really blame my loss in this game on either matchup or dice. I lost the old-fashioned way. Good old stupidity. This started early, in turn 1. Whilst Mrs. Claus cast a channeled blinding light to protect her Christmas compatriots from that dangerous poison shooting, my big Robin left her protective bubble to charge a model I'd compelled out of line. Of course, Dewey, being the clever boy he is, simply shot into that combat, first killing his own model and turning off the heroic combat, and then bringing the bird down to a single wound. What a silly sausage. But that sausage got even sillier the next turn when I basically did the same thing again. I used Radagast to try and block off his army, and then tried to line up a hurl with the bird, Treebeard meanwhile tried to walk the long way around the building. I felt he wasn't going to do much good sat behind Radagast. Radagast was surrounded and a cheeky strike combat duo got both him and the bird killed this turn. Meanwhile, Dewey sent riders off in every direction to claim his board quarters. Thranduil was the next to go. They simply charged him with a single model each turn and then moved the rest of the models within an inch to trap him and then just fired at that combat. Dewey routinely killed his own models, but that was a small price to pay to take down Santagast's greatest lieutenant. After all, he'd spent the entire game outside of Galadriel's 6-inch bubble. And with him gone, it was down to Galadriel and the Christmas tree. Beard. On that topic, you'll see that the Christmas tree, Beard gave up on his idea of going around the big building and doubled back, presumably to die with Mrs. Claus. Now Treebeard, being Treebeard, and carrying Mrs. Claus's snowman, was not going to make this easy. Watch this footage to see how long it actually takes to bring Treebeard down, how many evil models die before he finally manages it. However, eventually even the freshest of Christmas trees will wilt and drop its needles. Goodbye, dear friend. The final score was 11-0 to Dewey. With my game having finished so early, I went to spy on my friends and see how they were getting on. We then picked up a nice early lunch. Graham actually calls this the lunch protocol. It means concerning yourself not with winning or losing the first game, but simply finishing it as quickly as possible to beat the line. It was then time for one of my favourite bits, the painting competition, and there were some fantastic displays such as Natalie's Angmar with converted Gulliver, the spectacular blue on this army of Minas Tirith, and this wonderful ruined Gondorian city with what looks like to be quite a terrifying resin pour. There's also Harry Parkhill's competitor Christmas display, which features characters from Christmas films as Lord of the Rings miniatures. I also set up my own display, Merry's Christmas, with an utterly terrified Merry on the doorstep. And then we were on to round 2. For game 2, I'd play Adam Williamson and his quite unusual list. He was bringing Assault upon Helm's Deep, and of course, my heart stopped when I read that. Some nasty assault ballistas could make very short work indeed of my bird and take my mounts out lickety-split. But he didn't have any ballistas, or bombs for that matter. In fact, he had decided he wanted to shove as many Uruk-hai as possible into his list, and had therefore taken Assault upon Helm's Deep because the captains can take more Uruk-hai than they normally would be able to. I was therefore facing 4 captains and more Uruk-hai than you could shake a stick at. Also, on a side note, this is the second game in a row on a snow mat, so Christmas is obviously smiling on me. The game was Retrieval, where we deploy diagonally across the board, and then we'd have to retrieve a token from the other side's deployment zone. We were using my objective tokens, which were thematically appropriate chocolate coins. You can see mine there by the big bird, and his is strategically hidden behind the piece of weathertop there. My plan was to completely ignore protecting my objective, because I couldn't both protect mine and take his with only 5 models. My thinking was to aim for a tie on objectives, and then if I could break him, I would take the victory. With that being the case, my cabal of Christmas critters lined up with a direct line to the enemy objective, ready for the off. The Uruk-hai meanwhile made an impressive gun line of crossbows. Their leader's warband bulked up on the left-hand side, presumably ready to pounce on my own objective. There was no subtlety then to my plan. I tried to make a full-paced dash across the board to slip through that little gap between Weathertop and that wall before the Uruk-hai could block it. Galadriel channeled and then attempted to cast Blinding Light on a 2+ with her free dice, and for the second game in a row, rolled a 1.
I'm going to risk it on one wheel. Yeah, I got a 1 last minute.
So there we go, Galadriel is 2 mites down. Santagast did at least successfully cast Aura of Dismay, which I think is going to be extremely helpful in this game to protect him and the Christmas Elf. We then all survived a round of Uruk-hai shooting, and I was pleased to see they made no moves to block up the gap. As the next turn dawned, the Uruk-hai moved first, and they retreated away from my swirling vortex of jolly holiday oblivion. They were not fast enough, however, to stop me from setting up a tasty heroic combat with the Christmas Elf on the crossbowman at the end of the line. However, Team Evil decided to shoot into that combat, and even with the blinding light up...
Away from main guy.
Passed 1, failed 1.
Do I kill main guy? Yes.
What's more, he did a wound on the Christmas Elf to boot, although with the snowman right there on the bird, I don't think that was too much of a concern. What had been disappointing is I now risked losing my chance to kill the Uruk-hai captain, who was sat in the front line of the group protecting their objective. I wanted to kill him so that group no longer had any might to stop any moves that would stop me from getting on the objective and getting it out. I was therefore stuck in a bit of limbo. Treebeard was holding down one flank, but the bird was just perched up on Weathertop, Santagast was trying to hold down the rear, and hoping not to get swamped by Uruk-hai like he was in the first game, two berserkers were making unopposed progress toward my objective. They were a good shout, of course, because they're very unlikely to run away at the end of the game. I was at risk of just being bogged down and the game timing out before I could make progress. It was therefore a stroke of festive fortune that I moved before the captain, immobilised him, and in went my Christmas elf. I then made a little cage around him using the bird, the tree, and Santagast, with Galadriel sitting in the middle of a little castle. Then began one of the most epic gaming grinds I have ever been a part of. The Uruk-hai did their best to get as many models as they possibly could into Santagast. They surely knew that a fluffed dual roll and a couple of wasted might would leave him very vulnerable to being swamped. But their time was limited. The bird and Thranduil were making brief work of the Uruk-hai guarding the objective. Through all of this, the Christmas tree, Beard stood sentinel, blocking up an important choke point and stopping the Uruk-hai from making progress. And he's serious about it too, despite the festive regalia. I also have to say, I love this Uruk-hai banner doing the metal horns. It was almost a shame to compel him into base contact with Santagast so that I could kill it. On the other side of the board, the bird and Thranduil continued to pace toward the objective, Beard continued to stand sentinel, and in the middle of it all, Mrs. Claus enjoyed a nice cup of hot cocoa. In the next turn, it became apparent that I could no longer hold the castle. The Uruk-hai had gone round the edge of the building and could now break in through the northern side. I therefore had to pull the Christmas tree, Beard up to that gap to plug the hole, and pull Santagast back to plug that hole I'd just created. Whichever way I looked at it, there was going to be a gap, and time was now against me. Fortunately for me, Elf, Elk, and Bird continued to kill Uruk-hai at a rapid pace. Treebeard and Santagast proved absolutely immovable between their 3 wounds, 3 fate, Santagast's renew power giving wounds back, and Mrs. Claus's snowman giving fate back. The only chance the Uruk-hai had was to one-shot them, and at this stage of the game, they just couldn't manage it. At the beginning of the next turn, the bird had the prize, and it made a dash off to the west. The game, however, was not over. The Uruk-hai also had my objective, and they had a lot of crossbows with which to deal with Big Bird, who would no longer be within range of Renew, and would no longer be within range of Blinding Light. This also freed up my Christmas elf, giving him time to rush to the southern bottleneck to allow Mrs. Claus to make good on her escape. He would, however, now be surrounded, so very much needed to not fluff any dual rolls. As the Uruk-hai closed in, I realised that the choke points that had been my ally to date were now my greatest enemy. I needed to break out of one of them so that I didn't just get swamped and dragged down to an untimely death. If he broke me, then my whole drawing on objectives plan will be for naught. Anticipating that my bird is going to have to survive a few turns without support, the Uruk-hai moved out into the open where they'd get shots even as it moved back into my deployment zone. You can also see that the Uruk-hai here are making good progress back to their deployment zone with my objective marker. It was fortunate, therefore, that Santagast clearly had all the Uruk-hai on his naughty list and dished out the punishment. Yielding no ground, he and the Christmas elf gave Mrs. Claus all the time she needed to slip out of the castle in the gap between the rock and Christmas tree, Beard. This meant that Santagast and the Christmas elf simply formed a rearguard, fighting their retreat. The Uruk-hai did not let us go easy, but after winning a number of important moves, we managed to break out of the castle and into open ground. The Uruk-hai simply couldn't keep pace, and even more concerningly for the Isengard, I was bearing down on their chocolate coin carrying berserkers. All of this while my bird was back in my deployment zone, although there were still Uruk-hai crossbowmen lingering around to deal with. They managed to chip a wound off it, so I just hid behind a big rock. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't take too long to deal with the 2 berserkers. I could then just dash the coin back to my deployment zone. Isengard just didn't have the Uruks left to do anything about this. The game ended in a 12-1 to me. It had been quite a bad matchup for Adam. He had no models that could really deal with my big heroes. In turn, Santagast had just been a total beast all game. He must have killed at least 20 Uruk-hai himself. I also felt a bit bad abusing Renew and the Snowman because I essentially ended the game having only lost a single wound on the bird. In fact, if we play from when the fighting starts at 9,000% speed, you can see how quickly the Uruk-hai just dissolve, check out the dead pile in the top right hand corner of the screen. So there you have it. Fantastic game nonetheless, and it was time for a quick drink and a debrief before going into the final game of the day.
You actually bought a pint of Baileys. I bought a bottle and poured it into a pint.
The last game of the day was against David Nixon and another evil army, the Pits of Dol Guldur with Azog and the Keeper of the Dungeons. I actually think it's the first time I've done an entire day's tournament and played only Good v Evil games by accident. It was great. Such must be the power of Christmas. The scenario was admittedly another bad one for me, Reconnoiter. For anyone who doesn't know, it means counting the number of models you can get to escape off the opponent's board edge. David, with his Pits of Dol Guldur, had about 50 models he could do that with. I had 5. In this game, I legitimately felt like the colossal size of Santagast's base was my biggest asset. I needed to block up these choke points and keep him there for long enough to do the damage. The Christmas tree, Beard on the other hand, would be my brawler and would try and reach Azog if he possibly could. His wargs came rushing down the right hand side, and I had the speed to get over there, deal with them, and I thought, get back before the main force arrived in the centre. That at least went well enough. You'd expect Santagast and a Christmas elf to be more than the match for 2 shaggy dogs. But the bulk of the orcs pressed down the centre. In the open ground, I'd need to be very careful to stop my models from getting trapped constantly. I also needed to plug up this hole here to keep Galadriel from getting squished. Enter Santagast's sufficiently sizable base, and the bird to do the rest. All but the Christmas tree, Beard now had the cover of Mrs. Claus's blinding light and of her snowman. This was where I would make my stand. Given Rudolph's base didn't fit in that gap, I decided to send him and the Christmas elf off round the back. He could either slip off the board at the end of the game, or maybe find some cheeky characters to pulverise. I then set up a spicy heroic combat with Treebeard, by compelling an orc out of cohesion and exposing Azog on the left-hand side of the flank. I just needed Mrs. Claus to immobilise him, and I threw 3 dice at it, just so he couldn't call a strike to defend himself. She failed, and whilst I called the combat anyway to force Azog to burn the might, Treebeard ended up retreating meekly back to the house. Azog had had a lucky escape, and the next turn I made a bit of an error. I left my bird at the end of the line. With no might and no strike, it was vulnerable not only to dying, but to allowing the orcs to heroic combat off it and redistribute themselves around the rest of my models. Indeed, he did exactly that, calling a combat with the Keeper of the Dungeons and a strike with Azog. Now I had a stroke of luck, because Azog rolled a 1 on his strike roll, meaning that we were tying our fight value at 7. Then, I got a double 6 for my dual roll. Then, I won the roll-off as well. My Christmas Robin had been saved from my own stupidity by sheer, dumb luck. The downside was that even with 4 strikes at strength 6, the bird didn't cause a single wound, but hey ho, I cannot complain. In another stroke of poor fortune, Thranduil lost his combat and was taken off his elk. He'll now have to walk his way back to relevance with his legs. Next, Team Evil moved first, and the jaws of death really started to close in around me. It had been extremely unfortunate that I'd not been able to get the bird out of there. It was presently nothing but a big flappy liability. It proved that just moments later by dying, and allowing the orcs to redistribute themselves amongst the rest of my miniatures. They used that redistribution to slaughter Santagast in the same turn, thus robbing kids all over Middle-earth of their festive treats. More importantly, he robbed me of my chance of winning the game. It was already realistically over, but for good measure, Mrs. Claus died the next turn. Once again, my game had finished early, and so I went to see what everyone else was up to. Graham was being interviewed for Harry Parkhill's podcast, Entmoot. Chris was just totting up his scores.
15. What did you get?
And Hayden was enjoying the curry night with limited options as a vegetarian. To be fair, the food that we had was absolutely fantastic, and Hayden seemed happy enough. One of the best things about it was the sheer size of the naan bread. That's folded in half. And being fed 3 times a day, both days, cost me less than 20 quid. Bargain. After the games and the food, there was the customary quiz, and people really got into the spirit of it. It was festive. It was fantastic. To the extent that I think people would have probably preferred it not be caught on camera. I don't know what's happening here, but I will point out I just stand there and wobble for quite some time. And after doing the world's most dadly dancing, it was time to head back to the hotel. Having fallen asleep fully clothed, I woke up the next day mercifully hangover-free and ready for the tabletop. There'd been common consensus that we should suit up for day 2, so I pulled on my crinkly animal fur plastered rags, ready to paint the town, well, grey, I guess. You know what, I just felt very grateful to be there that weekend. At the end of a very stressful week, the vibe was just so relentlessly positive. There were more breakfast sandwiches, and then we dived straight in with Game 4. I'd be playing Daniel Thorpe at Breakthrough. Breakthrough means trying to take objectives furthest from your deployment zone. I'd be playing his double mummock list. His army was in the Grand Army of the South Legendary Legion and consisted of the Royal Mummock and a regular mummock. There were 11 models in total, including the 2 mummocks. Frankly, if I lose this game, shame on me. It will be exceedingly difficult for him to maneuver his mummocks through this terrain. I've got 2 compel spells, so I can try and ram the mummocks into terrain to get them killed, and I can also zip about the board picking up objectives, so there's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't be able to win it. Except, of course, my competence. I started the game tucked away in hiding spots across the board to make sure that I couldn't get rammed turn 1. Most of my models are highly resistant to a trample, but it's a good way to lose a mount or a couple of clutch wounds. The mummocks moved first, and the Royal Mummock dropped his warriors onto the rearmost objective to try and stop me from getting onto it. They then took a gentle stroll up the board, and my Christmas elf dashed out of cover across that little roadway there in an attempt to get onto that rearmost objective early in the game. Mrs. Claus tried and failed to command the mummock on the right, but Radagast succeeded against the one on the left, causing it to reverse into a wall and give itself a couple of wounds. However, I had not been careful enough with my Christmas elf. I called a panicked move, but the Royal Mummock has an ability to cancel it on a 4+, which it did. It therefore backed that up like a Tonka truck directly into my majestic elk. The elf survived, but Rudolph was smushed, and he was left in combat with what is essentially a 4-storey building. Having witnessed this, it's probably understandable that Mrs. Claus continued to lay low. In fact, this is all you could see of her from atop the War Mummock's howdah. We failed to get any more commands off this turn, and so the second mummock came back into the fray, advancing into this square in the centre of the board. Thrandy handily won his combat and just pushed back directly into the ruins. In the next turn, the mummocks moved first, and appeared to be performing a classic pincer movement. The one on the left advanced menacingly on the objective in my deployment zone, and the one on the right decided to, quite literally, sit on the objective. Galadriel successfully compelled this time the mummock on the left, taking it straight into the wall by Treebeard's feet. It caused even more wounds to itself, and then, to add insult to injury, my Christmas tree beard charged it. Meanwhile, Santagast charged those 2 poor Haradrim at the far side, looking to start to clear out the objectives at the backline. The Christmas elf wandered deeper into the ruins, and Galadriel remained safely tucked beneath her hiding spot. Radagast dealt swiftly with his Haradrim adversaries, and then Treebeard caused more wounds to the mummock on the left, causing it to stampede next turn. The Royal Mummock charged straight into Treebeard. The trample dice took every one of his fate, left now only with his wounds. It was fortunate then that he was carrying the snowman, and also that Galadriel managed to immobilise the mummock, stopping it from making any strikes in the subsequent combat. With the other mummock's stampede move, I marched it straight into a wall, bringing it down to its final few wounds. Meanwhile, the bird and the elf were getting proper sweaty and just basically being bullies to the 2 Haradrim left on the far side of the board. Despite my attempting to steal movement in the next turn, it was again cancelled by the Royal Mummock, and they moved first. The Royal Mummock trampled Treebeard again taking his fate off him, and then the second mummock would try and finish the job, but it would need 3 4+s on 4 dice, so I wasn't too worried.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
That got that mummock squarely on Santagast's naughty list. Not just his naughty list, his mega naughty list. He compelled the mummock into another wall and killed it. He basically caused this to happen. Luckily for him, while the mummock died, one of the crew members survived, and so might still be able to take the objective. He'd want the game to end soon though. The game went on another 2 turns, and while Galadriel sat behind the wall contesting one objective, and even charged it, hot chocolate in hand, to stop it from mauling Santagast, and while the bird and elf combo held the back line, Santagast charged the chieftain while it was still prone, taking it out the game and securing me a win. The final score was 9-3 to me. I was now getting used to finishing my games early and came over to see Hayden and Chris, who were playing each other. Chris was very excited to show me what he called his tactical hedge.
One little entrance where they've obviously like dragged the, even got wheel marks, where it looks like they dragged the,
I thought this was a fantastically themey little scene as the Uruk-hai tried to defend their siege weapon emplacement from the oncoming ghosts.
it looks like you're in a pretty good position.
They were all over there a second ago.
Looks like you're in a pretty good position.
I left them to it and got ready for my 5th game. Although I would have a while to wait given that we'd finished our game in less than an hour. In my next game, I'd be playing Elliot and his Host of the Dragon Emperor Legendary Legion. If you don't know what this legion is and want to know more about it, I strongly advise you to go to JMax Armies of Middle-earth and ask about it in the comments. He has feelings on the subject. The scenario is to the death, which for me is probably the least good of the killy scenarios, but still a winnable one. The reason it's not as good as, for example, Contest of Champions is that it's not just about my leader getting kills, it's about me having to kill his leader. You also get points for having a banner, which the Dragon Emperor counts as. He had the Dragon Emperor, Rutabi, and 2 Easterling Dragon Knights. My plan was to stick as a little ball using my overlapping buffs to stay alive long enough to be able to create a little gap to get to the Dragon Emperor. I didn't even necessarily need to kill him, although of course that would be a bonus. I had a remarkably survivable army, and so this is doable. For the first few turns, things were going swimmingly. I stayed put so I could use Santagast's Panic Steed to get their cavalry off their horses. I also used my Christmas tree beard to hurl a couple of cheeky presents at the Dragon Emperor and even caused a wound, although unfortunately we'd forgotten about that by the end of the game. I was therefore feeling reasonably pleased. My bird headed off to the left to get rid of the rest of the cavalry, hoping that it would do that swiftly and then could get back into the fray in time to do something particularly helpful. However, like all good things, it cannot last, and it was around about this point when the action started and everything started to go wrong. My downfall came, to be honest, through a mix of skill issues and luck. On the luck side, I would never win another roll-off for the rest of the game. That means about 7 or 8 turns of moving, I would not get to move first once, which means I would not cast a single spell again, or get to protect Galadriel, or set up any hurls, or take advantage of any charge bonuses. On the skill side, I did a lot of very silly things, like, as you can see on screen now, allowing Galadriel to be charged by failing to put her far enough away from the enemy. The other problem would be that my bird basically spent the entire game trying to take out these 2 riders. It would eventually succeed, but it made a bloody meal out of it. So the jaws of death not only closed in, but they just didn't really stop chewing for the rest of the game. In this combat with Santagast, for example, he got 22 dice to attack with, and at max I could only call Heroic Defense twice because I'd spent 1 might in the early game getting a spell to go off. With Treebeard, he was always very careful with his positioning to make sure I could neither get anywhere with a heroic combat, or help either Radagast or Galadriel with a cheeky hurl. But we did not give up, and in the late game, I managed to charge the Dragon Emperor with my Christmas elf. Treebeard and the bird were also in the fray, and given neither side was yet broken and no heroes injured, the only points currently scored were for the Dragon Emperor as a banner, and my 1 point for injuring the Dragon Emperor. As well as this, my Christmas elf had managed to charge this turn, so with 4 attacks at strength 5 because of his elk, I was in with a real shot. Unfortunately though, I had no might left with which to strike. The Dragon Emperor did. The Dragon Emperor is fight 6 and Thranduil is fight 7, so if he got a 1, I'd be alright. Anything else, and realistically, it's not going to go my way. He got a cheeky 4 and that was the end of my elf. With it, my hopes died too. If I'd remembered the wound on the Dragon Emperor, it would have been 12-1, and as it happened I didn't, and it was a 12-0. I had one more chance to equalise and get 3 wins for 3 losses, and for that chance I'd be playing Ned. Now Ned preferred not to be filmed, which is completely fine and understandable. If you're ever unfortunate enough to find me pointing a camera at your face, you can always say no. However, he did allow me to take some pictures, and it turned out to be a fantastic game, so I'm going to give you a quick recap. The game was Fog of War, and I'd be playing his mix of fiefdoms and Minas Tirith. Fog of War wasn't actually a bad one for me. I started, as I always seem to, as a little clump behind this house. His list included Imrahil, Forlong, Durinhir, and Madril. Durinhir led a group of Blackroot Vale archers who I'd not come across before and definitely underestimated. I made that house in the far corner my target for capturing, and I made Madril my target for assassination. I decided to try and protect Galadriel. I put up channeled blinding light, but Santagast split off from the group anyway, because that big hill would protect him. The bird remained in blinding light, but took the risk of jumping up on the hill to get a charge next turn. Santagast continued his long trek toward his target building whilst remaining in cover. Minas Tirith reorganised to turn the little square into a killing zone, and whilst it might look like Madril is giving an inspirational speech to the Fountain Court, he's actually immobilised. He looks like a prime target for the bird, as long as I can get the move off. I didn't get the move, and Madril fled. Still, it was now or never. My Christmas critters burst into the square. Unfortunately, I had been a little careless, and this gap between Santagast and Galadriel is a little over 6 inches. Certainly problematic. The archers shot him, and they killed the sleigh. For the first time all tournament, Santa was on foot. That costs him a remarkable amount of killing power. With that threat dealt with, the Fountain Court Guard moved in to protect Madril. I had after all somewhat given the game away by gunning for him so hard. But we don't give up, and with Santa taking shelter behind a low wall, the rest of the army piled in. And if I must say so myself, they looked strangely epic doing it. This would be a battle for the ages. Meanwhile, some of the fiefdoms warriors had arrived at this field, so I assumed that was probably their objective. On the other side of the battlefield, the warriors of Christmas clashed with the warriors of men. My guys came out unscathed. Meanwhile, Santagast was making good on a cheeky escape and inching his way toward the house. The archers of the Vale could no longer really see him behind the big rock and would have to get hand to hand. Seeing that the Lord of all Christmas was in trouble, my Christmas Robin and my Christmas Elf broke free of their opponents and raced over to his aid. Now, he really needed it, and he got it. His fellows came to his help and smashed the men on that side of the table. It was a brave move on the bird's part. Furlong came and joined the fray. Robin's season must have started early this year. Meanwhile, the remaining men of Gondor and the fiefdoms, including Imrahil, surrounded Treebeard and Galadriel. Santa and the Christmas Elf came dashing over to Galadriel's aid, not that she really needed it. She won her fight, presumably by splashing boiling cocoa in their eyes. The Christmas tree beard used Imrahil as a bludgeon, coming right up to the point of killing him, and wiping out a large portion of the Fountain Court Guard. This happened turn after turn after turn, even after the bird had sadly died and left the snowman out of range to help anyone. This trio of compatriots just simply could not be killed, but unfortunately the same could not be said for Galadriel. That meant that by the time the game ended, Ned had won it 9-0. So, there's the answer to how good a list of Christmas critters can be in a competitive MESBG tournament. Well, actually it's not, it's how good I can be with them, but I think other players could probably do quite a lot better. Thus rendering the entire video essentially a waste of time, although I have heard it said that time you enjoy wasting is not time wasted. So hopefully you enjoyed wasting your time. I certainly did at this absolutely fantastic tournament. Sadly, I couldn't stay for the entire prize giving. There were so many prizes to give out. We stayed just about long enough for me to pick up my prize for Best Army, which I was absolutely delighted about. My main Christmas competitor, of course, was Harry Parkhill, and you should watch his video as well. The link to it is in the description. All that's left to say is thank you so much. If this isn't your first video here, thank you for supporting me this year. It's been absolutely amazing. I have even bigger plans for the next year, but I couldn't do it without, well, basically my Patreon's money to waste, so thank you very much to them. Their names are all on screen now, but of course I have to pick a winner from my assigned Christmas models. Who was MVP this tournament? I actually have to give it to the Snowman. That Snowman did so much heavy lifting, keeping heroes alive well after they should have been alive, and getting me out of some sticky situations when I'd left them in the wrong place and they'd lost all their fate. That's a prize then for Doc Munoz, who's assigned the Christmas Snowman. If you do want to support to get gifts and prizes, and also to maybe one day get me to the point where I can do this full time, please do see the link in the description. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you very much indeed for watching.
What? You okay? Just a bit gassy. Not that you necessarily needed to know that, but
I did.
good.